The thick fog covered the sleeping city like a heavy blanket. It slowly rolled through empty streets and curled around the dim lights of gas lamps. During these quiet hours, when London was mostly silent, with only the far-off sound of a horse-drawn cab or a watchman's call breaking the night, I couldn't stop thinking about one of Holmes's most amazing adventures. It was a case so secret that even now, years later, I'm not sure if I should write about it. But the pictures keep coming back to me without being asked. The lonely inn at the edge of a quiet, empty field. The flickering lights in its windows. The strange whisper of something no one could see, but everyone could feel. And most of all, Sherlock Holmes, tall and thin, with eyes like a hawk, seeing through all the lies that would have left other men completely lost. What started as a quiet rumor soon pulled us into a messy situation of secrets and fear. How it ended left me both surprised and worried. Maybe this is one of those stories best left in a locked drawer, gathering dust. But being silent also has its dangers. If mysteries like this interest you as much as they once interested the readers of the Strand magazine, I ask you to stay with us. Pay attention as we walk again through foggy London and into a case where truth and fear walk together. If these memories make you imagine things, please share them so others can join us on this dimly lit trip back to Baker Street. And if you want more such trips, subscribe, like buying a ticket for the night mail coach, to make sure you never miss the next journey into the unknown. The case I will now try to tell you about is called The Phantom at Willow Creek Inn in my private notes. Even though its name was never in published books, I remember it clearly because the scary feelings it caused went far beyond the inn itself. The morning the Willow Creek Inn case began was gray and heavy, as if even the sky was unhappy about what was going to happen. The fog pressed against our sitting room windows at Baker Street, thick and yellow in the early light. Even the quiet cries of the milk sellers below seemed muffled by it. I had woken up earlier than usual because of bad dreams that often came with London's cold, wet winters. I found Holmes already awake, sitting with his legs crossed in his armchair, holding a piece of paper gently between his fingers, as if it were a butterfly he didn't want to crush. He didn't speak when I came in, but just nodded his head a little, his eyes quickly looking from the paper to me and back again. The fire in the fireplace was low, and a thin curl of smoke went up to the ceiling. Its light smell mixed with the smell of tobacco and wet wool. For several minutes, I busied myself with a teapot and the morning newspaper, waiting for him to speak. I knew from being with him for a long time that silence when Holmes was around often meant something important was about to be revealed. Finally, he said, "A strange thing, Watson. A very strange thing indeed." His voice was low, thoughtful, almost gentle. He put the paper on his knee, and I saw it was a letter, wrinkled, slightly stained, and with shaky handwriting from someone not used to being calm. The words had been written quickly, with blotches in places where the writer's hand must have shaken. "Another client in trouble?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful, though the heavy feeling in the air made it hard. Holmes gave a small smile. "Trouble, yes, but a less common kind. Read it aloud, please." I took the letter. It was dated the evening before, and had the address of an inn near Dartmoor. Willow Creek Inn, Devonshire Road. Its message was short. "Sir, I am told by those who know you that you are good at finding the truth in what others call impossible. I beg you, come at once. A terrible fear has taken over this house. We hear footsteps in empty hallways, see shadows where there should be none, and the air itself feels watched. One of my guests has disappeared. My servants will not stay another night. I cannot sleep. Please, for goodness sake, come before something worse happens to us. Edwin Murcher, owner." When I looked up, Holmes's eyes were still on me. There was a strong look in them that I had seen before, the calm before a chase, when his mind, like a hunting dog, was held back but eager to be let go. "What do you think of it, Watson?" I folded the letter carefully. "A man who is very scared, for sure, but maybe a man who imagines things. You and I have seen how being lonely and having poor lighting can affect nervous people." Holmes nodded in agreement. "Quite right. But notice the handwriting, how he tried to stay calm, the careful way he wrote, even when fear was pressing on him. This is not just someone being overly emotional. Also, he talks about someone disappearing. The idea of something supernatural must always be put aside for a human explanation when lives are in danger." He stood up, went to the window, and pulled back the curtain. Outside, the fog curled like loose wool along the street. The West Country moors, Watson. Lonely, dangerous land. I think we may find our phantom walking on two legs with a conscience that is more earthly than ghostly. I laughed quietly. "And you want us to go then?" He turned quickly, his face lit up by that special light of purpose I knew so well. "We leave by the noon train. Pack for 2 nights. Bring your gun." The matter was decided, as many of our adventures were. With a single word from Holmes, I spent the next hour getting my medical bag and notes ready while he walked around the room, mumbling his thoughts to himself, sometimes making a scraping sound with a match as he lit his pipe again. At 11 o'clock, a horse-drawn cab rattled to a stop outside, its horse impatiently stamping its foot in the mist. Mrs. Hudson saw us off with her usual worry, telling Holmes to wear his scarf and me not to let him starve himself on that terrible train food. The journey to Devonshire was long and sad. The land outside the window was gray and brown, hedges dripping with rain, fields made bare by the wind. Holmes sat still, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, while I switched between reading and looking at his reflection in the window. There were times when I wondered if he felt any of the excitement or worry that stirred in me. His calm seemed not human, his lack of emotion almost ghostly. At Exeter, we changed trains, then took a hired carriage for the remaining miles to Willow Creek. As the road wound through wet, marshy areas and bare trees, the mist got thicker again until the world looked like little more than a pale hallway of fog. It was then that the driver, a weather-beaten man with a West Country accent, broke the silence. "You're going to the inn, gentlemen?" "Yes," said Holmes without turning. "You know it?" "Know it? I do. And so does every man within 10 miles. Not one would pass that way after dark. Why?" Holmes's tone was gentle, but I noticed a small spark of curiosity in it. The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid the fog might hear him. "They say there's something there that isn't right. Lights in the upstairs windows when the rooms are empty. A shape as white as mist that walks the road at midnight. It used to be an inn for coaches a long time ago. Some say it's the old owner come back for his gold. Others say worse." Holmes didn't reply, but the slightest smile touched his lips. When the driver had turned his attention back to the reins, he whispered to me, "You see, Watson, the story comes before the proof. A convenient way to hide mischief, perhaps. We must remember, when ghosts walk, there is usually a man behind the mask." The rest of the journey passed in an uneasy silence. Night had fallen by the time the dark shape of the inn appeared from the mist. It was a long, low building of old weathered stone, its windows dimly lit, standing far away from any other building. The sign creaked faintly in the wind, its painted letters barely readable. Willow Creek Inn, 1792. Mr. Edwin Murcher himself met us at the door. He was a plump man in his middle years, his face tired from sleeplessness and worry. His hands, when they shook Holmes's, were cold and wet. "You have come," he said, his voice shaking with relief that was almost desperate. I barely dared to hope. "There have been events, sir, terrible events." Holmes nodded politely. We shall hear of them soon, but first a fire, if you please, and perhaps a cup of tea for my friend. The night is getting cold. We were led into the common room, where a low fire burned in the fireplace. The inn was almost empty. Only one other guest remained, a thin man reading by lamplight in the corner, his face half in shadow. Murcher followed my gaze and whispered, "Mr. Graves, a lawyer from London. He arrived 3 days ago. I've asked him to stay inside after dark, but he swears he fears nothing." Holmes's eyes quickly looked at the man before returning to Murcher. "And the servant who left?" "Gone yesterday morning. Said she would not stay where the dead walked." Holmes took his tea, but didn't drink it. "Then let us begin, Mr. Murcher. Tell me everything from the first moment you suspected this house was not as it should be." Murcher's story unfolded slowly, interrupted by glances toward the dark hallway beyond the door. "It began," he said, 2 weeks earlier when guests had complained of hearing footsteps at midnight in the upstairs hallway. Slow, careful steps that stopped outside certain doors only to fade away. Then came the whispers, soft, unclear, but clearly human. One of his maids, finding a candle burned all the way down in a locked room, swore she had heard breathing behind the door. And finally, 3 nights ago, a young lodger named Henry Vale had disappeared. His belongings remained in his room. The window was open, though it only looked out onto the marsh. No sign of a struggle. No trace of him running away, nothing but silence. During this story, Holmes sat very still, his fingers together under his chin, his eyes fixed on the flickering firelight. When Murcher had finished, he said softly, "You have searched the grounds?" "Every inch. I even went to the old well behind the stable. Found nothing." Holmes stood up and walked slowly to the window. The fog outside pressed close against the glass like a living thing. "Then we shall begin there tonight." Murcher turned pale. "Tonight?" "But, sir, the hour." Holmes's gaze turned sharp as a knife. "My dear Mr. Murcher, night is the investigator's helper. The day hides more than it shows. Watson and I shall take the hallway above, while you remain below. Should you hear any sound, do not move. Simply listen." I felt the familiar thrill of excitement mixed with unease. There was something heavy about that inn, the stillness of the walls, the faint smell of damp and smoke, the creaking of timbers settling as if the building itself was breathing. Later, as the clock struck 11, Holmes handed me a candle and silently pointed to the stairs. We went up together, the flame shaking in the draught, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet runner. The hallway above was long and dim, lined with closed doors. Somewhere a shutter banged faintly. Holmes paused halfway, raising a finger. From the far end of the passage came the faintest sound, a slow, steady walking sound, soft breath. He put out the candle. The darkness swallowed us completely. We waited. The steps came closer, steady, unhurried, stopping just beyond the turn. Then a whisper, not words, but a sigh, as if someone or something stood only a few feet away, listening. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. My hand instinctively went to the gun in my pocket. Holmes beside me moved like a shadow. There was a flash of metal as he drew his lantern, its cover snapping, open to shine light down the corridor. Nothing. Only the long empty hall and the faint sway of a curtain by the distant window. Holmes's face showed no emotion, but his voice, when he spoke, was very quiet. "Excellent," he murmured. "Our phantom keeps regular hours." He turned to me, the corners of his mouth lifting in that special half-smile that announced the beginning of some great discovery yet to come. "Tomorrow, Watson," he said softly, "we shall see how truly human our ghost is." The light dimmed. The fog pressed closer, and somewhere beyond the walls of the inn, a lone night-bird cried, a sound so sad it might have been mistaken for sorrow itself. The next morning came pale and unclear, a mist still hanging low over the marshes, like the breath of some sleeping giant. The inn seemed quieter than ever, its old wooden beams groaning faintly as if burdened by secrets. I woke to find Holmes already dressed and standing by the window, his thin outline against the pale light. His violin lay untouched on the chair beside him, something that told me more than words could. His mind was already at work, too busy for music. He didn't turn as I got up, but said in his steady voice, "Notice, Watson, the fog has not lifted. It thickens. Nature works to hide something, and man, I think, will help her with that plan." I joined him at the window. The land outside was a picture of emptiness. The moor stretched vast and empty, the wet grasses bending under a wind that had no color, only sound. From time to time, the blurry shape of a man or animal appeared out of the mist, only to vanish again. Somewhere, unseen, water trickled over stones. It was not a place made for comfort or company. Downstairs, Mr. Murcher waited for us in the common room, his eyes hollow from a sleepless night. He greeted us with the uneasy relief of someone who feels safer just by having another's calm presence. "Nothing more happened, gentlemen," he said, his voice low, as though the walls themselves might overhear. "Yet I swear once or twice I heard the floorboards creak in the passage. My nerves—" Holmes waved a hand gently. "We must trust to reason, not to nerves. You will help us best by acting as though no disturbance had ever taken place. Normal behavior is the helper of every deception. Now I should like to see the room from which your missing guest vanished." We climbed the narrow stairs, Holmes leading with a lantern in hand. The room in question was at the far end of the upper hallway. It was small, simply furnished, with a single bed, a writing table, a washstand, and a heavy curtain drawn across the window. On the table lay what was left of a traveler's things, a folded newspaper, a pipe, and a half-empty glass. Holmes went to the window first. It opened outward onto the moor, its sill damp and faintly marked by mud. The same trace I remembered that he had noticed the previous night. Below, the ground sloped sharply to a patch of reeds and black water that might once have been a stream. He murmured. "The window is 8 feet above the ground. The soil beneath is soft but undisturbed. No impression of boots, no broken reeds. Our vanished man did not go down this way, or if he did, he was carried." "Carried?" I repeated. Holmes turned, his eyes bright beneath the shadow of his brow. "Exactly, unless, of course, he walked away by himself under the cover of darkness. But that idea has its flaws." He pointed to the small fireplace, where a cold fire lay in ashes. "Our man was smoking not long before he disappeared. The ashes are fresh, the cigarette paper not crumpled. Would a man planning to run away sit down to smoke and read the news?" He crouched, examining the floorboards near the bed. "Notice, Watson, the faint scuff near the baseboard, a drag mark no more than an inch deep, as though something or someone was moved. I bent to see. It was barely visible, a smudge of dust and a scrape. Yet I knew better than to doubt the importance Holmes might find in such small signs. He straightened suddenly and walked to the door. And now the corridor. We followed the line of the passage to a narrow side door, half hidden by the corner of the wall. Murcher explained that it led to a servant's stair, long unused. Holmes tried the latch. It opened with a groan. A draught met us, smelling of damp plaster and disuse. We went down carefully, our lantern casting long, twisted shadows that clung to the walls like smoke. At the bottom of the stairs lay a small storeroom filled with broken furniture, barrels, and cobwebs as thick as ropes. Holmes examined the floor with his magnifying glass, tracing patterns invisible to my untrained eye. "Someone has passed here recently," he said. "2 persons, perhaps 3. One of them wore heavier boots." See the deeper impression. Murcher swore softly. But no one uses this stair, sir. Not for years. Holmes's voice was calm. Then perhaps your phantom enjoys solitude. The door to the yard, if you please. The outer door opened onto the back of the inn, where the fog was so thick that even the stable, a dozen steps away, was only a blurry shape. The silence was immense. Somewhere in that whiteness, water dripped faintly, and the cry of a curlew drifted, lonely and far. Holmes stood still for several moments, his face showing no expression, his head tilted slightly, as though listening to some hidden rhythm. "Remarkable," he said at last. "Watson, take note of the ground here. The faint circular dent near the door." I bent down. In the soft mud lay a shallow imprint, almost perfectly round. "A wheel?" I asked. "Just so, a small one, possibly from a wheelbarrow or handcart. Notice how recent it is, the edges still sharp. I bet this impression was made within the last 12 hours. He straightened, brushing the mud from his gloves. Our friend Mr. Vale may not have vanished into thin air after all. The question becomes, who took him, and why? Before I could reply, the quiet was broken by a sudden movement within the fog. A figure quickly coming toward us, appearing out of the whiteness, like a real phantom. It was the thin man from the common room, the lawyer Graves, his hat in hand, his expression one of surprised recognition. "Ah," Holmes said lightly, "our fellow guest, early riser, Mr. Graves." The man hesitated, his eyes flicking from Holmes to me. I heard voices, thought perhaps something was wrong. "Nothing wrong, I assure you," Holmes replied smoothly. "Merely taking the morning air. You're acquainted with Mr. Murcher, I believe?" "Of course," Graves said quickly, though I thought I noticed a flicker of unease. "He was kind enough to give me a room when the weather turned bad." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "And have you found your nights restful?" Graves gave a short, nervous laugh. "Restful? In this place? Hardly. But I am not a man to let superstition bother me. My work requires too much reason for that." "Your work?" Holmes asked gently. "I am a lawyer down here on business regarding a small estate." "Nothing important." Holmes nodded his head as though the matter were closed. Yet I knew from the slight tightening of his mouth that his interest had been stirred. When the man had left, vanishing once more into the mist, Holmes turned to me. An educated man, not used to fear, yet his pulse beat fast enough to betray him. There is more to Mr. Graves than his modesty suggests. We shall keep him in mind. We spent the rest of the morning examining the grounds. The inn stood on a small hill overlooking the marsh. To one side, a path led to a small bridge over the slow-moving waters of the creek. Beyond that, the moor stretched unbroken to the horizon, its grasses shaking under a wind that carried the faintest smell of peat and decay. "Lonely country," I remarked. "An excellent stage for crime," Holmes answered. "Few witnesses, fewer questions. A body might lie here for weeks without being found. The law, like light, traveled slowly across such ground." We returned to the inn near noon. The fog had thinned slightly, allowing brief glimpses of the road, and with it came a new arrival, a mail cart rattling to a halt before the door. The driver, a stout countryman, handed Murcher a packet of letters. As he did so, Holmes's eyes caught a detail so small I would have missed it completely. A smear of black on the man's sleeve as though from soot or oil. "Coal dust," he murmured to me when the fellow departed. "And yet the nearest coal yard lies 5 miles east. Curious." That afternoon, Holmes secluded himself in our room, pacing in thoughtful silence, while I tried to busy myself with the local paper. Once he paused beside the fireplace and said absent-mindedly, "Tell me, Watson, what do you learn from the pattern of a man's fears?" "I beg your pardon?" "Fears, my dear fellow, they show habits." Consider our innkeeper. His terror is rooted in the unseen, the unnatural. That is the fear of an honest man. But the lawyer's unease, though less obvious, comes from hiding things, not from belief. The difference may guide us. And the phantom? Holmes smiled faintly. Ah, that. Let us not give our enemy more charm than he deserves. By tonight we shall know whether our ghost bleeds when pricked. Evening fell once more. The fog returned with dusk, wrapping the inn in silence. Holmes ordered the lamps put out, except for one, which he placed at the far end of the hallway, its dim glow a lure in the darkness. Then, gun in hand, he took position near the stairs. I waited a few steps behind, my nerves tense, my heart listening for every faint creak and sigh of the old building. An hour passed, then two. The clock below struck midnight. Nothing stirred. At last, when my patience was almost gone, a sound came, a faint scrape of wood against metal. Holmes stiffened. We heard it again, the quiet turn of a handle, the whisper of a door easing open. He moved forward silently, the beam of his lantern cutting a thin blade through the gloom. From the direction of Mr. Graves's room came the glow of a candle and the shape of a man, half-dressed, slipping into the corridor with a small package beneath his arm. Holmes's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Good evening, Mr. Graves." The man froze. For an instant his face was filled with fear, then calculation. He turned to run, but Holmes was quicker. In 2 steps he caught his arm, the package falling with a dull thud upon the floorboards. The paper burst, spilling its contents. A set of ledgers, a rusted key, and a folded map stained dark with age. Graves slumped against the wall, his calm gone. "I can explain." "I have no doubt you can," Holmes said coolly. "But I suggest we postpone the attempt until morning. Watson, kindly secure the gentleman's door. Mr. Murcher will provide us with another lock." As I fastened the bolt, Holmes examined the fallen papers with keen interest. Among them was a slip of parchment bearing a crude sketch of the inn's layout, and beneath it a note written in a firm hand. "The well, beneath the east wall." Holmes's eyes met mine. "Our phantom's graveyard, perhaps," he said softly. "Tomorrow we dig." The fog beyond the windows thickened once more, swallowing the lamp's glow until the night itself seemed to breathe around us. Slow, deliberate, and waiting dawn arrived muted and unclear, as though the light itself hesitated to step into that sad place. The fog had lifted slightly, showing the dull outline of the moor, but a pale mist still hung over the inn. The events of the previous night had left their mark on every face. Mr. Murcher's skin had turned the color of old paper. The servants moved about like ghosts, and even the clatter of dishes seemed quieter, as though the house was afraid to disturb what lingered in its shadows. Holmes, however, appeared energized. He had slept little, if at all, yet there was a brightness in his eye that told me his mind had grasped an important clue in the messy mystery. He was already at the breakfast table when I came downstairs. The rusted key and map we had taken from Graves lay before him like old relics on an altar. His fingers tapped lightly on the tabletop, the rhythm precise and thoughtful. "Good morning, Watson," he said, not looking up. "Our guest, Mr. Graves, is still confined to his room under your supervision?" Indeed, he made no attempt to leave, though I suspect he scarcely slept. "Excellent. Fear, when given correctly, can be a most clear confessor." He rose and folded the map carefully, slipping it into his pocket. "Now, before we confront our lawyer, we must hear the full account of our host. I fancy Mr. Murcher's tale will fill in certain shadows left between the lines of this curious document." Murcher entered at that moment, pale and worried, his hands twisting a cloth he had been carrying. "Gentlemen," he began, "I scarcely know how to speak of what has troubled this house. Since my wife's death last winter, there have been changes. At first, I thought they were tricks of my mind, caused by being alone, but then others began to notice. The first was the maid, Annie. She heard a sound one night, footsteps pacing above her room, though no one stayed there. When she went to look, she swore she saw the outline of a man pass across the landing, tall, thin, and white as dust. The lamp went out, and she fainted. She left the next day, and no amount of begging could make her stay. Holmes looked at him closely. "Did you see this figure yourself?" "No, sir, but I've heard it more times than I care to count. The sound comes between midnight and 1, always the same slow walk from the old part of the inn to the new. Once I followed it as far as the east wall, but there the steps stopped, and the air grew so cold I could scarcely breathe." "The east wall," Holmes repeated, his voice soft, as if checking the words against some mental plan. "That is the very wall beneath which our map places the well." Murcher nodded sadly. "The well was dug before my grandfather's time. They say it was closed after a man fell in and drowned, though no body was ever found." Holmes's expression did not change, yet a flicker of satisfaction crossed his eyes. "And this man, his name?" "I never knew, sir, only that he was a traveler, a guest like the one who vanished now." "Interesting symmetry," Holmes murmured. "Two disappearances separated by decades, tied to one place, and both surrounded by superstition. You see, Watson, history is the most patient of accomplices." He turned abruptly toward Murcher. "Tell me of your present lodger, Mr. Vale, how he came here, and what you observed before his disappearance." Murcher drew a deep breath. "He arrived 2 weeks ago, alone. Said he was traveling to Plymouth on business, and wished for quiet, paid in advance in gold coins. A polite man, soft-spoken, yet there was something uneasy about him. He kept to himself, avoided the other guests. On the second night, he asked whether the inn had an old well, and when I told him it had, he grew pale and changed the subject. Later I saw him walking the grounds by lantern light. I thought little of it then, but after that night the sounds began again." Holmes moved to the window and stood there for a moment, the gray daylight touching his profile. "You have said enough, Mr. Murcher. I believe we are ready to dig up the truth. Quite literally, I fear." At his request, we fetched spades and lanterns and made our way to the back of the inn, where the ground sloped downward to a hollow overgrown with reeds. The fog had thinned, but the air was heavy with the smell of wet earth. Holmes's eyes moved swiftly over the ground, measuring distances. "Here," he said, pointing to a patch of moss-grown stone half buried in the soil. "The shape matches the drawing precisely. Observe, Watson, the faint curve of stonework beneath the grass." We set to work clearing the area. The stones came away easily, their cement crumbling with age. Within half an hour, the outline of the well appeared, a circular opening of blackness framed by rotting boards. When Holmes pulled one free, a damp breath of air rose from the depths, carrying the smell of decay. Murcher stepped back, making the sign of the cross. I had no idea it still stood open. My father swore it was sealed. Holmes leaned over the edge, lowering the lantern until its glow touched the glistening water far below. "Sealed, yes, but not filled. And you see, Watson, how the stones near the rim bear newer marks. Someone has disturbed this place recently." "You believe Vale was thrown down there?" I asked. Holmes's face was serious. "Or descended of his own accord in pursuit of something or someone. We rigged a rope from the stable and fastened it to the old beam beside the opening. Holmes went down first, his thin body disappearing into the gloom with a swiftness that made my heart tighten. I followed, the damp stone scraping my hands until my boots found the slippery ground below. The space was small, no more than 12 feet deep. The bottom was covered in mud and still water. The lantern light flickered across something half buried near the wall. A scrap of cloth. Holmes knelt beside it, brushing away the slime. It was a torn sleeve, the fabric fine and dark, clearly recently made. In its seam was caught a single thread of red wax. Holmes examined it closely, his eyes bright. A seal, Watson. A document sealed in haste. Perhaps one that Mr. Graves was very anxious to recover. Before I could reply, he motioned for silence. From above came the faint creak of a board. We froze. A shadow crossed the circle of light from the well's mouth and vanished. Holmes's voice was barely a whisper. Someone is watching. We put out the lantern and waited. Minutes passed, heavy and silent. Then the noise moved away. When at last we climbed out, the yard was empty. Yet Holmes's keen gaze fell upon a set of footprints in the mud, fresh, distinct, leading toward the east wing. We followed them swiftly, entering through a side door that groaned on its hinges. The corridor beyond was dim, the air stale with neglect. At its end stood a narrow door secured by a rusted padlock. Holmes drew the key we had found among Graves's things and tried it. The lock opened with a soft click. Inside was a small room, windowless and cold. A single candle burned upon a table cluttered with papers, maps, and ledgers. And seated there, his back to us, was Mr. Graves. He started violently at our entrance, rising so quickly that the candle wavered. "Mr. Graves," said Holmes, his voice as even as ever, "you are hard at work for a man under house arrest." The lawyer's calm broke. "You have no right, no warrant, no need of one," Holmes interrupted. "Your actions show more than any paper could. You were found prowling the corridor last night, carrying these." He laid the ledgers and map upon the table. "Shall we add this chamber to your confession?" Graves's eyes darted to Mercer, then back to Holmes. For a moment it seemed he might try to deny it, but the uselessness of it was clear. His shoulders slumped. "You don't understand," he said hoarsely. "I came here to recover what was mine by law, what was stolen from me by lies. I meant no harm." Holmes folded his arms. "Then explain the missing man." Graves sank into the chair, covering his face with both hands. "Vale was my clerk once. He knew of certain papers, proof of a claim on this property. He came ahead of me, intending to find them and sell them to another. We quarreled. I swear I did not mean his death. He fled into the night toward the well. I followed, but he was gone. When I looked down, I saw the water stir. I thought he had fallen. I buried what I could and sealed the chamber." His voice faded into silence. Holmes regarded him with a strange expression, not pity exactly, but something close to it. "And the phantom?" Graves gave a bitter laugh. "The villagers made that for me. Every creak, every shadow became his ghost. I let them think so. It kept them away while I searched." Holmes drew in a long breath. "Fear, guilt, and greed. 3 familiar partners in crime. Yet your tale is incomplete, Mr. Graves. There remains the matter of the document whose seal we found below. You destroyed it, I presume." Graves hesitated, then nodded. "It proved my deceit as well as his. Better lost than found." Holmes turned to me. "There, Watson, lies the true ghost conscience. It walks more persistently than any spirit created by superstition." He summoned Mercer to send for the constable at once. When Graves was taken away under guard, the inn seemed to breathe out as though relieved of a long-held breath. The air lightened. Even the fog outside had begun to break. Later, as we stood beside the old well once more, Holmes looked down into its dark depth and said quietly, "There is always a reasonable explanation, Watson, but seldom a simple one. Superstition is but the shape ignorance gives to guilt. I asked him then whether he believed Vale truly dead. Holmes's gaze did not leave the water. That, my dear friend, remains uncertain. Amour keeps many secrets. We may yet hear his name again, but not from human lips. As we turned back toward the inn, the first ray of sunlight pierced the mist, hitting the sign above the door, so that its letters gleamed briefly before fading again into shadow. Night returned to the inn with a quietness that was almost planned, as though the darkness itself sought to take back its rule after the brief visit of daylight. The arrest of Graves had quieted the obvious fears that haunted the house, but an unease lingered, subtle, yet impossible to escape. The servants, though reassured by Holmes's calm authority, still made the sign of the cross when the floorboards creaked or when a door swung on its hinge. Mr. Murcher, relieved to see the lawyer in custody, none the less confessed to me that the silence of the house seemed now heavier than before, as though the air itself waited for something unseen to stir. Holmes, for his part, appeared neither restless nor content. He had spent the afternoon writing letters, one to Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard, another to a certain Mr. Alderton, a judge in Exeter, and afterward taken a solitary walk across the moor. When he returned, his boots were caked with mud, and his expression unreadable. He said little during supper, eating sparingly, as always. But I could see from the rhythm of his fingers upon the table, and the faraway look in his eyes, that some inner mechanism of deduction had begun its relentless turning. "You are uneasy," I suggested, when the silence between us had stretched too long. "Not uneasy," he said, "merely uncertain. Graves's confession has filled many empty spaces, yet left one page noticeably untouched. There is something at work here still hidden, something that moves even now while we sit at table." "You think there was another helper?" Holmes's gaze shifted toward the window, where the last of the daylight seeped into the mist. "I think," he said slowly, "that the well is not yet dry." Before I could ask his meaning, the door opened and Murcher entered, clearly agitated. "Beg pardon, gentlemen, but there's a man at the gate. Refuses to come in. Says he must speak to you, Mr. Holmes, and no one else." Holmes rose at once. "Show him in." Moments later, a figure appeared in the doorway, a shepherd by his clothes, his weather-beaten face half hidden by a cap pulled low. His eyes, sharp and pale as the moorland sky, darted nervously about the room before settling on Holmes. "You're the London detective?" he asked in a voice made rough by wind and solitude. Holmes inclined his head. "I am." "Speak freely. Mr. Watson is my colleague." The man hesitated, twisting his cap in his hands. "I've kept sheep yonder near the creek these 20 years. Last night, just after moonrise, I saw someone moving down by the marsh road. Thought it were a traveler, till I saw him stop by the stone cross and kneel like he were bearing something. When I called out, he bolted into the fog. I went to look this morning. There were tracks, fresh ones, and a bit of red cloth caught on a thorn." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "You still have it?" The shepherd produced the scrap from his pocket. Holmes examined it closely under the lamp, his features tightening with interest. "The same weave and dye as the sleeve we found in the well. Remarkable, Watson. The plot thickens precisely where we thought it had ended. Mr. Murcher, have my telegrams been sent?" "Yes, sir. The constable took them to the station himself." "Excellent. Then we shall require his company again tonight." Holmes turned to the shepherd. "You have rendered us great service. Can you guide us to this stone cross?" "If the fog don't close in again." Holmes's decision was immediate. "Then we go now. Fetch your lantern, Watson. Mr. Murcher, lock all doors behind us and admit no one until we return." The air outside was colder than before, the fog rising again in ghostly wisps that curled around the lamplight. The shepherd led the way, his sure footing on the marsh path showing long familiarity. The moor lay vast and silent, the only sound the slow drip of water from reeds and the distant cry of some unseen bird. After half an hour's walk, the faint outline of a weathered cross emerged from the mist, an old relic of some forgotten age, its base half sunken in the earth. Holmes knelt beside it, his lantern casting an amber glow upon the ground. "Here," he murmured, brushing aside the damp moss. Beneath, the soil was freshly turned. With the shepherd's spade, we uncovered a small tin box bound with wire. Holmes cut the binding with his knife and opened it. Inside lay a bundle of documents wrapped in oiled paper and sealed with the same red wax we had found before. Holmes examined the top sheet by lantern light. "Deeds," he said quietly. "Property transfers. Most likely those graves saw it. But this handwriting—" He paused, holding the paper closer. "Not his, and not Vale's either. Then whose?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. His eyes scanned the page again, his lips tightening. "We must get these to better light. Come back to the inn." As we walked back, a distant sound reached us, the faint rumble of wheels on the road. Holmes stopped, listening intently. "A carriage," he said, "and driven fast. Curious hour for visitors." When we arrived, we found a police wagon drawn up before the door, and Inspector Lestrade himself getting out, his face red from the cold. "Holmes!" he exclaimed. "Your telegram was a riddle as usual. Something about a phantom, a well, and a man who confesses too much. What devilry have you uncovered this time?" "Patience, my dear Lestrade," Holmes replied with a faint smile. "You shall see for yourself. Come inside." Inside, by the fire's glow, Holmes spread the damp papers upon the table. Lestrade bent over them with a puzzled frown. "Property deeds," he said, "belonging to good Lord Edwin Murcher." Holmes nodded. "It appears so. Yet these are not his originals. They are clever forgeries executed some months ago, and held as leverage in what was to become a most profitable little conspiracy. Graves was the tool, but not the hand." Lestrade straightened, his brow furrowed. "Then who forged them?" Holmes's eyes lifted slowly toward the doorway. "Why not ask our host?" Murcher froze in the doorway, a tray trembling in his grasp. "Sir, surely you cannot think—" "On the contrary," said Holmes evenly, "I think very little. I merely observe. You claimed ignorance of the well's history. Yet your name appears here in connection with a land exchange dated 15 years past, witnessed by one Henry Vale, your supposed missing guest." The tray slipped from Murcher's hands and crashed to the floor, his face drained of color. "You don't understand. Yes, I knew him years ago. We were partners in the purchase of this property. But the papers were never filed. Vale disappeared then, as he has now. Or perhaps," said Holmes, "he never disappeared at all. Perhaps he changed his name. Graves spoke of a clerk who turned on him, a man who knew too much. Suppose that man returned here not as a stranger, but as a helper, drawn back to complete what had begun long ago." Lestrade stepped forward sharply. "Are you saying Murcher and Graves were working together?" Holmes shook his head. "Once, perhaps. But greed breaks alliances. When Vale, or the man calling himself Vale, returned, he brought with him knowledge enough to ruin Murcher and blackmail Graves. The plan turned bad. One tried to outsmart the other. The phantom of Willow Creek was born not of superstition, but of betrayal." Murcher slumped into a chair, his eyes hollow. "He threatened me," he whispered. "Said he'd expose the forgery if I didn't pay. I thought I could frighten him off. I told the servants stories, lit the candles myself, made them think the house was haunted, but when he vanished, God forgive me, I thought it meant the end of it." Holmes regarded him gravely. It was only the beginning. You and Graves each built your own ghost to hide your guilt, and in doing so, you nearly convinced yourselves of its existence. Lestrade's men took Murcher into custody at once. Outside, the fog thickened again, wrapping the house in silence. When the door closed behind the inspector and his prisoner, Holmes stood a long while without speaking. At last, he said softly, "Strange, is it not, Watson? How easily men summon phantoms when the true terror lies within themselves. The moor breeds no ghosts. Yet guilt will always find a form sound, shadow, or face to remind its master that it lives." We sat by the fire, then, the only light flickering across Holmes's sharp features. I thought him tired, but his eyes still burned with that fierce inner fire I had seen many times before, the flame that could only be put out by absolute truth. "Do you think it is over?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward the window, where the fog pressed once more against the glass, thick as smoke. "Over," he repeated quietly. "No, Watson. Something remains unsettled. Graves's terror was real, but not entirely of his own making. There was a third presence here, someone unseen who moved between them, turning fear to profit. And until I know that name, I shall not rest." The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind rose across the moor, low and mournful, like a voice calling from beneath the earth. The following night descended with a peculiar stillness that was not peace, but suspense. Every sound, no matter how small the sigh of wind beneath the eaves, the faint scrape of a shutter, the distant cry of an owl, seemed full of meaning. The Willow Creek Inn, though cleansed of its living deceivers, still carried the weight of something unresolved. Holmes, who had spent the day in patient observation, sat now in the flickering glow of the common room fire, a cigarette hanging between his fingers and a faraway gleam in his eye. He looked, as he often did in such moments, less a man than a machine, one designed to grind truth from the grit of human lies. I had tried more than once to draw him into conversation, but he answered only in pieces. His mind was elsewhere, half in the present, half in some reconstruction invisible to ordinary reason. When at last he spoke, it was as though he were continuing a conversation already long in progress. "There is a rhythm to crime, Watson," he said quietly. "A coming and going. Most men act rashly in anger or fear. But here we have a plan. Cool, deliberate, almost like music in its steps. Each actor enters, plays his note, and leaves. Yet the melody continues. Graves and Murcher were not composers. They were instruments. Someone else conducted this symphony of lies." "You refer to the unseen third party?" I asked. "Precisely. The ghost's ghost, if you will. The presence that neither confessed nor fled, because it was never accused. There is a mind behind this disguise, and I intend to meet it before dawn." The clock on the mantel struck 10. Holmes rose abruptly and moved to the staircase, pausing to light a lantern. "Come, Watson. Tonight we return to the upper corridor. I would see whether our phantom still walks when no guilty conscience remains to summon it." The inn was almost empty. The servants had fled after the arrests, leaving only a single stable hand asleep in the loft. The silence was immense. As we went up, the flame of Holmes's lantern trembled, throwing long crooked shadows along the wall. The corridor stretched before us like the throat of some sleeping beast, narrow, black, and waiting. Holmes paused at the landing. "Do you feel it, Watson? That curious tension in the air? The house still listens." I nodded, though I could not have said why. There was indeed an oppressive awareness in those upper rooms, as though the walls remembered what men wished to forget. Holmes handed me a second lantern and gestured for me to follow. We began our watch. Moving from door to door, Holmes examined each lock, each hinge, each panel of flooring, his movements as precise as a surgeon's cuts. At the far end of the passage, he stopped before the room once occupied by Henry Vale. The door stood slightly open, and within the air felt colder than the rest of the house. The fire had long since gone out, and the smell of mold hung thick upon the air. Holmes stepped inside, his lantern beam sweeping across the bare bed frame, the scattered remains of papers, the faint outline of a man's boot mark in dust. He crouched beside the fireplace. "Observe, Watson. The ashes have been disturbed by the constables, perhaps." He shook his head. "No, these marks are fresh. Within the last 12 hours. Lestrade's men departed at noon, and we have kept watch since. I felt a chill trace my spine. Someone has returned here under cover of evening. For what purpose?" Holmes did not answer. His gaze had fixed upon the mantelpiece, where a thin strip of wood appeared slightly out of place. He took out his penknife, pried it loose, and drew forth a folded slip of paper hidden in the hollow behind. He opened it carefully. It was a telegram, faded but readable. "To Edwin Murcher, Willow Creek Inn, Devonshire. The claim proceeds. Keep Graves silent. Will join you when the road is clear. A.A." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A.I., the initials of our conductor. Note the date, Watson. 3 weeks before the first disturbances. The plan was long in motion. But who?" I began, when a faint sound silenced me. From beyond the door came the unmistakable creak of a floorboard. Slow, deliberate, close. Holmes motioned for the lamp to be dimmed. We waited in darkness, holding our breath. The steps drew nearer, pausing just outside the room. Then, with infinite care, the latch turned. The door opened a hand's breadth, and a face appeared in the sliver of light. A woman's face, pale, with sharp features, framed by a dark shawl. She stepped inside, unaware of our presence, moving like one who knew the path by heart. In her hand, she carried a small case of polished wood. Holmes's voice cut the silence. "Good evening, Miss Alderton." The woman started violently, nearly dropping the case. "Who?" she began, then caught sight of him and stiffened. "So you know my name." "Indeed," said Holmes, stepping forward. "Alderton, the same signature I found upon the magistrate's letter of transfer this morning. You have excellent handwriting for a forger." Her eyes narrowed. "You have no proof." "On the contrary," he replied softly. "You have just provided it. That case in your hand, permit me to guess, contains the duplicate seals and templates used in the false deeds you and Graves prepared. Murcher supplied the land, Graves the legal access, and you the finishing touch." She gave a bitter laugh. "You are clever, Mr. Holmes, but cleverness cannot undo the past. I came only to take what was mine and leave this cursed place forever." Holmes's expression did not change. "And yet you lingered long enough to search the ashes, perhaps hoping the original deed survived the fire." She hesitated. "He promised it would be safe." "Who?" "Graves." Her silence was answer enough. Holmes's tone softened, though it lost none of its precision. "Miss Alderton, your talents are wasted in crime. You might have been a capable draftswoman or clerk had you chosen honest work, but you chose deceit, and deceit is a poor employer." "Save your sermon," she said coldly. "You cannot deliver me to justice. You have no warrant." "True," Holmes replied, "but Inspector Lestrade has, and he will return before dawn." Her eyes flashed. "Then you will not live to hand me over." Before I could move, she had drawn a small pistol from her shawl, but Holmes was quicker. With a swift motion, he struck her wrist, sending the weapon clattering to the floor. The lantern fell, the flames sputtered, and for an instant the room was plunged into half-darkness, filled with struggle. When I reached them, Holmes had her disarmed and pinned against the wall, her breath coming in furious gasps. "Enough," he said quietly. "Violence was never your gift, Miss Alderton. You deal in ink and cunning, not blood." Her defiance broke then, and she slumped in his grip. "It wasn't meant to end this way," she whispered. "Vale was supposed to sell me the papers. When he refused, Graves said we must frighten him, make him think the place was cursed. I lit the candles, played the ghost, but he fell into the well. It was an accident." Holmes released her and stepped back. His voice, when he spoke again, was low, almost weary. "So ends the haunting of Willow Creek. The phantom was a woman with a lamp walking corridors while guilt slept below. Fear did the rest. We escorted her downstairs, where I secured her in the study until Lestrade's return." Holmes remained by the window, gazing out at the moor. The fog had lifted completely now, revealing a vast plain under the silver of a fading moon. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "how fitting that this drama began and ended in shadows. Man's greatest illusions are of his own making. A whisper becomes a legend, a flicker of light, a phantom, yet behind them always lies the simple human motive: greed, jealousy, or fear." "And Vale?" I asked quietly. "Is it certain he is dead?" Holmes's eyes did not leave the horizon. "Not certain. But if he lives, he will surface when the law stirs these waters. And should the marsh conceal him, it will not conceal his deeds. Nature, too, keeps her own records." He turned then, drawing his coat about him. "We shall remain one more night. There is a completeness to this case that invites reflection. The moor has yielded its secrets, but not yet its peace." I left him there at the window, his figure outlined against the pale glow, the smoke of his cigarette rising in fragile spirals. Beyond, the silent corridor stretched into darkness once more, but its silence no longer threatened. It was the silence of truth after revelation, the quiet that follows confession. When the ghosts of imagination finally retreat before the dawn, dawn crept over the moor in a thin wash of pearl and gray, hesitant and cold. The Willow Creek Inn stood silent beneath that paling sky, its stones glistening with dew, its windows dark, except for the faint glow of embers in the common room hearth. After the commotion of the preceding nights, a strange calm had descended. Yet it was not peace. It was the quiet that follows revelation, a fragile stillness stretched over deeper unrest. Holmes had not slept. I found him seated at the table with his violin across his knees, though he did not play. The bow rested lightly in his fingers, his eyes unfocused, as though he listened to a melody only he could hear. When I spoke, he started slightly, returning from whatever maze of thought had clinged him. "Ah, Watson," he murmured, "you will forgive my distraction. I find myself haunted, not by phantoms of superstition, but by the ghost of probability." I poured him a cup of coffee, dark and steaming. "You mean the case is not yet settled?" He accepted the cup with a nod, his gaze distant. "Settled on the surface. Yes. Graves and Murcher conspired in forgery. Miss Alderton gave it substance, and the unfortunate Vale paid the price of their foolishness. Lestrade is content. He has culprits, confessions, and paperwork to occupy his superiors. But I, my dear friend, have something he lacks: doubt." "On what point?" Holmes rose and paced slowly before the hearth. "Upon one point only: the man named Henry Vale. His death, though convenient to all, remains unproven. The well yields no body. Yet every tale agrees upon his vanishing. The human imagination, Watson, is a master of substitution. It creates death where it cannot find truth." Before I could answer, the sound of carriage wheels broke the morning stillness. Holmes moved to the window, and I joined him just in time to see Lestrade alight from a wagon, 2 constables at his side. He looked brisk, red-faced, and faintly triumphant. "Holmes," he called cheerily as he entered. "I've taken your Miss Alderton to Exeter Jail. Confession signed, evidence secured. The Crown will have no difficulty with this one. As for the body in the well, we shall drain it by noon and put an end to your doubts." Holmes's lips curved faintly. "An end, Inspector? I've rarely seen you so optimistic." "Come now," said Lestrade, clapping his gloves together. "Even you must admit the thing's tidy. 3 culprits, 1 victim, and not a ghost left in Devonshire." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And if the well holds not 1, but 2? Lestrade blinked. "2? Patience," Holmes said. "You shall see." The constables set to work at once, rigging a pump and winch beside the old well. The machinery wheezed and groaned, drawing up dark water that reeked of decay. I could not help recalling our descent into that pit of shadow, the cold touch of stone, the stifling air, the single torn scrap of cloth glistening with slime. The memory clung to me as the rope creaked and the first bucket emerged. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, scattering the last tatters of mist. Holmes observed every motion, with the stillness of a predator waiting for its moment to strike. Then, near noon, one of the men gave a cry. Something pale had broken the surface, a shape rising slowly through the water, limp and distorted. When it reached the air, the stench drove even the constable's back. It was a body. Lestrade crossed himself softly. Good Lord, so the man did fall after all. Holmes bent over the remains, his expression unreadable. "Not fall," he said quietly. "Note the bruising along the wrists, the rope marks. He was bound before he entered the water. This was no accident." Lestrade frowned. "Then one of the others, Graves or Alderton, must have killed him." "Unlikely," said Holmes. "They had motive for deceit, but not for murder. The timing does not fit. Vale vanished before the others quarreled. No, this was arranged by a fourth hand, one clever enough to use their guilt as camouflage." He turned the body gently, revealing the face, swollen and gray, yet faintly recognizable. A ring still clung to one finger, engraved with initials. Holmes drew it off and examined it in the sunlight. HV, as expected, but looked closer. He held it toward us. The inner band bears another engraving, to HV from AA, Miss Alderton's initials. She did not forge her affection, at least. Lestrade scratched his head. So they were lovers? Or partners who mistook trust for affection, Holmes murmured. Either way, this ring complicates her tale of accident. The constables carried the body away for examination, and Lestrade departed soon after, satisfied that justice, in his view, had been neatly delivered. But Holmes lingered beside the well, silent, his gaze fixed on the muddy imprint left by the men's boots. At length he said softly, "Watson, what do you make of the bruise upon the throat?" "I saw it," I replied. "A single mark, almost circular, just so. Too narrow for a rope, too broad for a cord. It suggests something smooth, metallic, drawn tight, a ring, perhaps, on the killer's finger." He met my eye. And who among them wore such a ring? I thought hard. Graves, I believe. A signet, plain gold. Precisely. Yet when arrested, his hand was bare. He claimed to have lost it. You think he strangled Vale before Alderton arrived? Holmes shook his head. No, Graves lacked courage for direct violence. He was a man of ink and ledgers, not of blood. There is another hand in this, someone with both strength and motive to silence Vale, and perhaps to silence others, should they speak. He turned abruptly toward the inn. Come, there is one place we have not yet searched with proper attention, the cellar. The descent was steep and narrow, the air thick with damp and the lingering scent of mold. Our lanterns threw shifting halos against the walls, revealing rows of dusty casks and broken crates. Holmes moved among them with swift precision, tapping each in turn. At the far end, behind a stack of firewood, his stick struck hollow stone. He knelt, brushed aside the debris, and revealed a small recess. Within lay a metal box, locked and rusted. Holmes picked the lock with ease. Inside were letters, receipts, and a leather-bound journal. He opened it carefully, scanning the first page. A faint smile touched his lips. Ah, the missing voice of Henry Vale. The entries were brief but revealing. Notes of meetings, payments, and suspicions. The last entry, dated 3 nights before his disappearance, read, "He comes tonight to settle the matter, says the claim is worthless. I fear his intent. If I do not return, seek the man who signs himself not Alderton, but another, the magistrate." Holmes closed the book slowly. So the magistrate was not merely a name on a letter. He was the hidden architect, the one who used his position to shield forgery, extort land, and dispose of inconvenient witnesses. I stared. But he is a man of law, Holmes. Surely. Holmes's voice cut through gently. The law, my dear Watson, is merely the tool. Its wielder may yet be corrupt. How better to ensure silence than to bury guilt beneath official seals? He rose, brushing dust from his knees. We must ride for Exeter tonight. The Alderton will not expect his daughter's arrest to awaken the ghost he thought drowned. The journey was grim and silent. By the time we reached Exeter, dusk had returned, draping the streets in twilight. The magistrate's residence stood at the edge of town, a broad house of dark brick, its windows glowing faintly with lamplight. Holmes strode to the door and rang. The man who received us was tall and thin, his hair silver, his manner composed. But when Holmes introduced himself, I saw a flicker of something fear, recognition, or both. "Mr. Holmes," he said slowly, "your reputation precedes you. But I cannot imagine what brings you here." Holmes produced the journal and laid it upon the table. "This, sir, brings me here. Henry Vale's own hand. It speaks of a man who used his power to forge titles and silence the guilty with the illusion of justice. That man is you." For a moment, Alderton said nothing. Then he gave a soft, weary laugh. "So she told you? Your daughter confessed only to her part. She believed herself your accomplice. In truth, she was your shield. When the forgery began to crumble, you arranged the disappearance of the one man who could name you. A magistrate's word carries weight. Who would doubt your reports? The legend of the phantom was a convenient distraction." The old man's face hardened. And if it were true, what then? Vale was a parasite, a thief. He would have ruined us all. Holmes's voice was low, cold as steel. He was already ruined. You merely ensured his silence, and in doing so, you condemned your daughter to infamy. Alderton's composure faltered. Then he sank into a chair, his hands trembling. She was innocent in this. I swear it. I meant only to protect her. Yet you built the gallows beneath her feet, Holmes said quietly. The room fell silent, save for the faint ticking of a clock. At last the magistrate raised his head. What will you do? I shall do nothing, Holmes said. The law will act as it must. I have sent a wire to Lestrade already. He will arrive by morning. When we left him, the lamps still burned within, though no figure moved behind the curtains. As we returned through the sleeping streets, Holmes walked in silence, his face unreadable. At length he said, almost to himself, how strange that justice, like truth, so often demands its own shadow before it can be seen. The wind had risen again across the moor by the time we reached Willow Creek. The inn loomed in the distance, its windows glimmering faintly through the mist. Holmes paused before the door, his gaze lifted toward the paling stars. The phantom is gone, Watson, he said softly. But the mark remains on stone, on conscience, on the soul of every man who trades truth for gain. That is the true haunting of Willow Creek. The morning that followed our journey to Exeter was one of those chill, clear dawns peculiar to the English West air, like glass. The moor spread vast and still beneath a sky drained of all color. A faint mist lingered in the hollows, curling about the reeds like ghostly breath. But above it, the sunlight fell clean and sharp. The Willow Creek Inn stood solitary against that brightness, its walls streaked with the damp of the night before, its sign creaking faintly in the wind. All seemed quiet, yet beneath that quiet there pulsed the weight of consequence. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. The servants, who only a day earlier crept about as though fearing each shadow, now spoke more freely. The dread of phantoms had given way to curiosity and gossip. Only Holmes appeared untouched by the transformation. He sat once more by the fire, his long fingers together, his gaze fixed upon the curling smoke, as though tracing the invisible line that bound cause to effect. Inspector Lestrade arrived shortly after breakfast, his carriage rumbling to a stop outside with the pomp of official urgency. He entered with a brisk step and a certain self-satisfaction that bespoke both fatigue and triumph. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he began, rubbing his hands, "your telegram was a masterpiece of brevity and terror. Arrest Magistrate Alderton. Charge murder of Henry Vale. That's the sort of thing to make a man spill his tea. I've brought him in under escort, and I dare say the newspapers will have it before nightfall." Holmes looked up without rising. "And the daughter?" "In custody still," Lestrade replied. "The old man tried to shield her, but we've statements enough to separate the guilty from the misguided. I'll see she's treated with leniency. Poor thing looks near broken." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "It is not often I pity those who err, but Miss Alderton's guilt is born of devotion, a frailty more human than criminal. I trust, Lestrade, that your superiors will see it so." The inspector snorted. "We shall see. The law's not sentimental, but credit where it's due, Mr. Holmes. Your instincts were right again. Had we left it to the local men, they'd have hanged the wrong ghosts entirely." Holmes smiled faintly, but there was weariness in his eyes. "Ghosts, indeed. They do seem difficult to exorcise from the English countryside. Tell me, has the magistrate spoken?" Lestrade nodded grimly. "He confessed this morning. Claims Vale threatened to expose the forgeries, demanded money. They met by the well to settle the matter. There was a struggle. Vale went over, bound and silenced. The old man swears it was accident, but that's a tale for children. He'll face the courts by week's end." Holmes rose then, crossing to the window where the sunlight fell faintly on the sill. "So the circle closes. Greed begets deceit. Deceit breeds fear, and fear leads to violence. Each imagines he controls the chain until it tightens about his own throat." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably, unused to moral reflection from his colleague. "Well, it's justice now at any rate. I'll file the reports and see the Crown gets its proof. The press will make a feast of it. The phantom that never was. It'll sell papers, if nothing else." Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "Justice, yes, but peace, no. You'll find the countryside slower to forgive than the law." Lestrade laughed shortly. "You philosophers tire me, Holmes. You catch the villains. I catch the headlines. Between us, the world keeps turning." He departed soon after, leaving the inn once again in uneasy quiet. I joined Holmes by the hearth. "You look troubled," I said. "Surely your work here is done." Holmes shook his head slowly. "A detective's work is never done, Watson. It merely changes shape. The riddle of Willow Creek may be solved, but what remains is the echo, the consequences that ripple outward unseen. Men like Alderton leave stains upon those around them. Miss Alderton will carry hers all her life. And as for the villagers, they will continue to speak of lights in the windows and voices on the moor long after the truth is forgotten. He spoke with a sadness rare in him. The sunlight caught his sharp profile, turning the smoke from his pipe into a thin veil about his face. "Sometimes I wonder," he said softly, "whether truth itself is but another kind of phantom, real only until the next mist rises." At that moment, a commotion outside drew our attention. A boy burst into the room, a stable hand, breathless and pale. "Beg pardon, sir, but there's folk coming up the road. Reporters, I think, and constables with them. And," he hesitated, "and there's someone else. A man they found by the creek." Holmes was on his feet at once. "A man?" "Aye, sir, alive, they say, half drowned but breathing." We followed him swiftly outside. Down by the bridge, a small crowd had gathered. 2 constables were lifting a limp figure from a cart, wrapping him in a blanket. Holmes pushed through, his eyes widening as he saw the face. It was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, and streaked with mud, but unmistakably human. "Henry Vale," he breathed. The man's eyelids fluttered. His voice came in a hoarse whisper. "Holmes, I knew you'd come." For an instant, the world seemed to still. Lestrade, arriving in haste from his departing carriage, stared as though at an apparition. "Good heavens," he muttered. "Then who was it we found in the well?" Holmes knelt beside the man. "Later, Inspector. I helped him carry him inside. They bore Vale to an upstairs room, where I tended to his wounds. He had been wandering for days," he said, "hiding in the marsh after escaping an attack. The man he'd met by the well was not Alderton, but another, a stranger who struck him from behind and cast him into the water. He had clung to the stones, half drowned until the tide carried him clear. His memory was broken, his strength nearly gone, yet his story bore the ring of truth." Holmes listened intently, every word sharpening the focus of his thoughts. "Describe this stranger," he urged. "Tall," Vale murmured, "broad-shouldered, wore a rough coat, smelled of tar and rope." "A sailor, perhaps?" Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "A sailor ... and the moor but 20 miles from the coast. Curious." Lestrade frowned. "But what motive would a sailor have in this affair?" Holmes straightened. "Not his own. He was hired. By whom we must yet learn. It seems the magistrate Alderton, in his vanity, was not the only hand at work. The deeper one digs, the more roots appear. Vale's return changes everything." That afternoon, Holmes and I rode with Lestrade to Exeter once more. The magistrate, already in custody, paled at the news. "Alive," he whispered when told. "Then I am undone." "On the contrary," said Holmes coldly, "you are corrected. Vale's account exonerates you of direct murder, though not of conspiracy. Your hired thug exceeded his orders, a risk every coward runs when he employs strength to mask fear." The old man's composure crumbled. "I meant only to frighten him. I never ordered his death." Holmes regarded him with chill precision. "You ordered violence. The rest followed as naturally as decay follows corruption." Outside the cell, Lestrade turned to Holmes. "You've given the man a reprieve, though he'll still hang for his forgeries." "And Miss Alderton, she will go free," Holmes said. "The law may punish crime, but it cannot mend the human heart. That must heal or fester as it can." We returned to Baker Street some days later. Yet the case refused to leave us. The newspapers predictably turned it into a sensation. The phantom that bled, the ghost that lied. Holmes unmasks the Marsh murderers. Each headline louder than the last. London devoured the story, never caring that the true tragedy was quieter. A daughter ruined by devotion, a father destroyed by pride, a victim returned from death to face the emptiness left behind. One evening, as the gaslights burned low and the city outside hummed with its ceaseless rhythm. I found Holmes once more at his window, the fog of London thick as ever beyond the glass. "You are thinking of the inn," I said. He nodded. "Of its silence and the sound beneath it. There was a moment, Watson, standing by that well, when I thought I heard something, a single drop echoing far below. I've thought since that perhaps the earth itself keeps memory of every crime committed upon it. Men may forget. The soil does not." He turned then, his face half in shadow, half in firelight. "I told you once that truth and ghosts are much the same. Both linger only so long as there are men to believe in them, and yet, for all our reason, we are haunted still." The clock struck, marking the hour with solemn grace. Holmes resumed his violin, drawing from it a low, wistful note that seemed to carry across the dim streets like a sigh. Thus ended the affair of the phantom at Willow Creek Inn, or so it seemed. For even in victory I felt the faint chill of something unresolved, as though that lonely moor, with its reeds and whispering fog, still watched us from afar, guarding one secret yet unspoken dot. It was a damp and cheerless morning in Baker Street, when the first of the newspapers arrived, its pages still glistening with ink, the smell of it sharp and strong against the smoke of Holmes's pipe. I found him already awake, sitting at the table with his dressing-gown loosely tied, the signs of a sleepless night around his eyes. The Morning Chronicle lay open before him, its headline bold enough to catch the eye of even the most casual passer-by: "The Phantom of Willow Creek Inn. Murder, forgery, and Sherlock Holmes." Beneath it, a rough drawing showed a shadowy figure looming above a well. Holmes's name was printed below, as though he himself had risen from the darkness he sought to get rid of. He looked up as I entered, his expression half amused, half tired. "Observe, Watson, the modern myth in progress. It appears that our phantom has survived his own getting rid of." I took the paper from him and read the first lines aloud. A tale to chill the blood and stir the imagination. The latest triumph of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who once more proves that reason may lay even the dead to rest. I paused, unable to stop a smile. "You should be pleased, Holmes. They've made you the hero of a ghost story." He breathed out slowly, the smoke from his pipe curling upward like a thin ghost itself. "A dangerous promotion. The public loves to dress fact in make-believe, Watson. Give them a dead body, and they demand a haunting. Give them a criminal, and they ask for a demon. The truth, as ever, is too plain to satisfy." "But surely," I said, settling opposite him, "it does no harm to see reason praised." He regarded me with that faintly sarcastic patience he reserved for my optimism. "Ah, but it is not reason they praise. It is spectacle. They admire the flame, not the fuel. I fear they will remember the phantom more vividly than the crime that created it." He tapped the page thoughtfully. "See here, the artist has placed the well directly beneath a crescent moon. Charming, but the moon was new that night. Detail is the first loss in the war between truth and imagination." Before I could respond, there came a brisk knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed, slightly flustered. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says he's from the Strand." Holmes sighed. "The sickness spreads. Very well. Show him up." Moments later, a young reporter entered, nervous, eager, his notebook clutched like a shield. "Mr. Holmes, it's an honor. My editor sent me to request, well, to beg, really, your personal account of the Willow Creek affair. The readers adore your adventures. He said no one could tell it better than Dr. Watson, of course, but he'd like a statement from the detective himself." Holmes's lips twitched. "Ah, yes, my faithful storyteller's pen has already made me the property of the public's imagination. Tell your editor that I prefer my ghosts confined to the pages of Dr. Watson's discretion." The young man blinked, uncertain whether he was being made fun of. "Then you'll not speak on the matter?" Not to the press, Holmes said curtly. Print adds things. Truth disappears. You may tell your readers that the case was one of human foolishness, helped only by the law's timely intervention. That should satisfy those who prefer their horror safely explained. The reporter hesitated, then bowed awkwardly and left. When the door closed, Holmes gave a soft chuckle. Poor fellow, he came in pursuit of the supernatural and leaves burdened with common sense. It will ruin his column. I folded the newspaper and laid it aside. You're too hard on them, Holmes. The world must have its stories. They give shape to things it cannot understand. Precisely, he replied, and therein lies the danger. Men invent ghosts not to frighten themselves, or to excuse their blindness. The phantom at Willow Creek was never a spirit. It was the shadow of greed. Yet they prefer the version with mist and lanterns. It flatters their fears while sparing their conscience. He rose and began to pace, his dressing gown trailing like smoke behind him. Mark my words, Watson. By week's end, there will be plays, pamphlets, perhaps even seances claiming communication with the spirit of the moor. Lestrade will pose for photographs beside the well, and some second-rate novelist will christen it the Cursed Inn of Devonshire. And when the dust has settled, no one will remember Henry Vale, the man who suffered, not the ghost who entertained. There was a bitterness in his tone that I had seldom heard. I ventured gently, "Does it disturb you, Holmes, that your work creates myths?" He stopped, turning toward me with that quick, piercing intensity that seemed to draw the light itself to his eyes. Disturb me? No, but it cautions me. Every legend begins as a truth misunderstood. One day they will write of me, Watson, not as I am, but as they wish me to be. The detective who sees all feels nothing. The mind without mercy. It will not be true, but it will last. Perhaps that, too, is a kind of ghost. We were interrupted again, this time by the rattle of wheels outside. A telegram had arrived. Holmes tore it open, scanning its contents with the same calm precision he might have given a secret code. Then he handed it to me. From Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard, 8:40 a.m. Alderton collapsed during morning hearing, died before confession completed. Coroner requests your presence to confirm evidence. Bring notes of Vale's journal. Urgent. Holmes's expression darkened. So the final witness silences himself. The circle tightens again, but not neatly. There are threads yet untied. Within the hour, we were on the train to Exeter, the countryside blurring past in streaks of rain and smoke. Holmes sat motionless, his chin upon his hand, his gaze fixed on the shifting horizon. When he spoke, it was as though to himself. Death, Watson, has the curious habit of arriving too conveniently for liars. Alderton's end may seem natural, but I have learned never to accept convenience where deceit has dwelt. A man who poisons justice may poison himself, or be poisoned to prevent it. I stared at him. You think he was murdered? I think, Holmes said slowly, that a story too carefully concluded often hides an unwritten ending. We reached Exeter under a sky the color of pewter. The coroner's office was a narrow building on the edge of the main street, smelling of disinfectant and wet wool. Lestrade greeted us at the door, his usual confidence subdued. Heart failure, they say, he muttered, collapsed while signing the statement. But there's something odd. Look here. He led us into the small chamber where the magistrate's body lay covered by a sheet. Holmes lifted it with respectful care. The old man's face was peaceful, almost serene, but at the corner of his mouth a faint bluish stain marred the skin. Holmes touched it lightly, then bent to examine the nails. Discoloration, he said. Prussic acid, or something similar. Quick, quiet, and decisive. He did not take it by choice. Lestrade swore under his breath. Then someone silenced him. Precisely, Holmes said. Someone who feared his confession might implicate them further. The hired sailor, perhaps, or his employer's rival, or someone else entirely. He straightened, his eyes narrowing. This, my dear Watson, is what comes of truth handled carelessly. The press has stirred waters best left still, and now we must wade through them once more. We left the coroner's office as the rain began to fall, fine and steady, softening the edges of the world into a watercolor of gray. Holmes walked in silence beside me, his collar turned up, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Another phantom," I said at last. "A ghost of the living this time." He smiled faintly. "Yes, the ghost of consequence. It follows us all, though most choose not to look back. The magistrate's death will be called justice by some, coincidence by others, but I, Watson, I call it unfinished business." That evening, as the train carried us back toward London, the lamps flickered in the dimness, casting reflections across the glass like fleeting faces. Holmes leaned against the window, his voice low and thoughtful. "Do you recall the inn's corridor, the hush before we lit our lantern, the sense that something unseen waited there? That same hush now lies over this affair. There is one more shadow moving in the dark, and I mean to find it before it finds us." He closed his eyes then, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels blending with the whisper of the rain. I watched him, wondering whether he pursued truth, or whether in some strange way truth now pursued him. For in the dim glow of the carriage, I thought I saw that old familiar expression, half triumph, half sadness, the look of a man who has seen too much of both reason and its limits. Thus the phantom of Willow Creek, reborn by the press, had escaped once more into the world, not as terror, but as rumor, not as ghost, but as symbol. And as the train sped through the night, I could not help but feel that somewhere, in the shifting fog between fact and imagination, the case was not yet closed. The night train reached London under a shroud of mist. The gaslights along the station arches burned weakly, their reflections trembling in the rain-slicked cobblestones. It was near midnight when Holmes and I emerged onto Baker Street, the fog following us like a living thing. London had the same air of secrecy as the moor, a city of countless shadows, each one concealing its own small deception. Holmes walked ahead of me, his coat drawn close, his stride swift and silent. He had spoken scarcely a word since our departure from Exeter. The death of Alderton, which Lestrade would have called a conclusion, had left him restless. I knew that look, the look of a mind circling an unsolved pattern, aware that one piece still lay missing. Inside our sitting room, the fire had burned low, but Mrs. Hudson, bless her, had left the kettle warm upon the grate. I poured us both a measure of tea, though Holmes barely touched his. He stood before the window, the lamplight catching the thin lines of exhaustion upon his face. "You perceive, Watson," he said at last, "that the true phantom of Willow Creek has not yet shown its face." "I thought we had named it," I said quietly. "Greed, guilt, deceit. Call it what you will. The guilty are accounted for, and the dead laid to rest." Holmes turned toward me with that faint smile I knew too well, the one that suggested I had missed the single vital chord in a symphony. "Ah, but there is still the living, my dear friend, and the living seldom rest. Consider a hired sailor who vanishes into the mist after an unfinished murder. A magistrate whose sudden death removes all trace of higher conspiracy. A series of forged deeds, each profitable, yet all incomplete. And lastly, the mysterious letters signed with Alderton's initials. Tell me, who benefited when both Vale and Alderton were silenced?" I frowned. If not Alderton himself, then who could? Someone close enough to use his authority and inherit his ruin without question, Holmes said softly. A man or woman of quiet cunning, hidden by proximity, the sort of shadow that attaches itself to power and outlives it. He crossed to the table, and drew from his coat the last of Vale's papers. "Observe, Watson. Vale's handwriting falters near the end, as though written under fear. Yet the ink changes tone here." He pointed to a faint line midway down the final page. "Darker, wetter, applied by another hand." The continuation reads, "I am resolved to meet him tonight. A has promised safety if I deliver the originals." But this edition is not Vale's. The loop of the A and the slant of the T are distinctly feminine. I leaned closer. "You mean Alderton's daughter?" Holmes's eyes flashed. "Precisely. The very woman we presumed misled. She may have believed herself a pawn in her father's schemes, but I fear she played a deeper game. Her affection for Vale was genuine, yet she saw profit as well as love. When the forgery faltered, she pitted father against lover and meant to claim the spoils of both. I was about to protest when the doorbell rang sharp, insistent. Holmes motioned for silence. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson's voice sounded in the hall, followed by hesitant footsteps. The door opened, and there she stood, Miss Alderton herself. She was pale as bone, her black cloak beaded with rain, her eyes wide with something between fear and defiance. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling but steady, "I've come to tell you the truth before it's too late." Holmes regarded her calmly. "An admirable decision, though somewhat belated. Pray sit. You are expected." "Expected?" She faltered, clearly taken aback. "Indeed," Holmes said, "you have been in London since yesterday, residing under an assumed name at the Langham Hotel. Your arrival here was a question not of if, but of when. The walls of guilt, Miss Alderton, have a curious way of echoing one's own footsteps." She sank into the chair opposite him, the firelight touching her face and revealing lines of exhaustion far older than her years. "I didn't kill him," she said suddenly. "Not Vale, not my father. You must believe that." Holmes inclined his head. "I believe you did not wield the weapon, but you set the board upon which they destroyed each other." Her composure broke then. "I never meant for it to go so far. Vale wanted the papers, the originals that proved my father's claim false. He swore he would sell them, and I thought if I could take them first, I could save us both. I asked him to meet me at the inn, but my father learned of it. He sent a man to frighten Vale, to keep him silent. When Vale fell, I thought him dead. My father confessed only after, and I, God help me, I thought silence my only refuge." Holmes listened without comment, his gaze unblinking. When she finished, he asked quietly, "And the sailor?" "I never saw his face," she whispered. "Only his hands, rough, scarred, with a ring on the thumb." Holmes straightened abruptly. "A ring? Describe it." "Silver, with a crest. 2 crossed anchors." A low whistle escaped him. "Then the fog lifts at last. That ring belongs to a man named Jonah Keir, first mate of the Thessaly, a ship registered out of Plymouth. He served time at Dartmoor for smuggling, was released 3 months before the Willow Creek affair. Vale once testified against him in a customs case. When Alderton sought a strong arm to do his bidding, Keir would have welcomed revenge at any price. He paced the room, every movement sharp with energy. "Do you see, Watson? The circle completes itself. Alderton hired Keir to scare Vale. Keir struck too hard and afterward saw opportunity. When the magistrate's death was convenient, Keir returned to claim his silence fee and delivered poison instead. A single chain of causes forged by greed, polished by fear. Miss Alderton had risen, trembling. Then it's finished. He'll be caught." Holmes stopped, his voice gentler than I had heard it in days. "He will be found. Scotland Yard has his description now, and ships may run, but cannot hide from the sea's own witnesses. Yet you must also face what remains. The ghosts of the living, Miss Alderton, are not laid so easily as those of the dead. She bowed her head, tears glinting in the firelight. You mean my conscience? I mean your future, Holmes said softly. Do not let it be written by others. Leave England for a time, somewhere quiet. Truth will outlast rumor. She rose then, thanked him faintly, and departed without another word. When the door closed, the silence that followed felt like a blessing. The rain against the window had softened to a steady rhythm, and for a long while neither of us spoke. At last Holmes stirred. Strange creature, the human conscience. It breeds phantoms of its own, none visible, yet more persistent than any spectre of mist or moonlight. He drew on his pipe, the ember flaring briefly. Watson, do you know what I find most curious? What's that? That the only true ghost at Willow Creek was guilt, passed from mind to mind until it infected them all. Graves feared exposure. Murcher feared ruin. Alderton feared disgrace. And Miss Alderton feared herself. Fear, my dear fellow, is the most contagious of human sicknesses. He turned toward the fire, his face half in shadow. Keir will be caught before the month is out. But even when he hangs, the tale will not die. The newspapers will still speak of a phantom, and travelers will still point to that inn and whisper of the footsteps in its halls. Truth, as I told you, is too plain for memory. He fell silent again, lost in thought. The clock struck 1, its chime soft and deliberate. Outside the fog pressed close against the window pane, curling in tendrils that caught the lamplight and seemed almost to move. Holmes rose, drew the curtain shut, and spoke without turning. It is a curious thing, Watson, how the world requires its mysteries. Deny them ghosts, and they will make one of you instead. I smiled faintly. If that be your fate, Holmes, I shall ensure the legend flatters the man. He looked back at me then, his eyes warming with rare amusement. See that it does not, my friend. My reputation survives only by your mercy and your pen. He extinguished the lamp, leaving the fire to flicker low. In that final hour before dawn, with the city veiled in fog and silence, I could almost believe the whole affair had been a dream. A brief haunting of reason by imagination, played out upon a lonely moor and carried home in rumor. Yet, as Holmes seated himself once more by the dying embers, his face calm but unsmiling, I knew that some shadows never fully leave. Thus ended in appearance, if not in truth, the long pursuit of the phantom at Willow Creek Inn. The law had its victory, the world its story, and Sherlock Holmes, his quiet justification. But I, who saw the toll each mystery took from that brilliant mind, knew better. The case was closed, yet the fog remained, and in its drifting silence I fancied I heard again the echo of slow, measured footsteps upon a distant corridor dot. It was some weeks later that I found the courage to return to my notes on the Willow Creek affair. London had settled into the damp sadness of late winter, fog curling along the Thames, the streets gleaming with rain, and the gas lamps shining through it like dull, watchful eyes. Holmes had thrown himself into other work, a case of stolen money in the city, and a peculiar business involving a violin dealer from Prague. Yet even in his busiest hours, I caught glimpses of distraction, the faint wrinkle between his eyebrows that showed thought turned inward. He never spoke of Devonshire again, and I, respecting the habit of silence which so often served as his method of reflection, did not press him. But one morning in February, as I sat at the breakfast table revising the draft that would later appear in my journals, Holmes looked up from his letters and said quietly, "You intend to publish it?" I started, pen poised above the page. The Willow Creek case? Yes, it is too remarkable to remain untold. The world has already twisted it beyond recognition. Someone must set the record straight. Holmes smiled faintly. And who better than the good doctor who keeps both watch and conscience for me? Yet I wonder whether truth will fare any better in your ink than in theirs. I shall tell it faithfully, I protested. As it was. Ah, he murmured. But nothing is ever as it was, Watson. We remember by light and shadow, and between them lies invention. Still, he waved a hand as though dismissing some private doubt. Perhaps your version will do less harm than the others. Proceed, then. The world must have its ghosts. He turned back to his letter, but I saw the brief tightening of his jaw and knew the subject was not as easily dismissed as his tone suggested. Later that day, as we prepared to walk to the post office, a telegram arrived. Holmes read it in silence, then passed it to me. It was from Lestrade. Sailor Keir, captured in Southampton, admits to attack on Vale, but denies poisoning Alderton. Claims was paid by unknown party, signing only H, believe still watched. Requests your presence. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that sharp light I had not seen since the first night at Baker Street when the Willow Creek letter arrived. So the fog thickens once more, he said. A new hand, perhaps the oldest of all. We took the first train south. The journey was long and gray, the countryside stripped of color beneath low clouds. Holmes was silent for most of it, but I could see his mind at work, that invisible clockwork of deduction moving beneath the calm exterior. At Southampton, Lestrade met us on the platform. He's in the jail, Mr. Holmes, a surly devil, but frightened. Claims he's been followed since he left Devonshire. Says I'll talk to no one but you. We followed him through narrow streets slick with salt air to the small coastal prison. In a low stone cell sat Jonah Keir, the sailor who had dragged so many lives into his undertow. He looked older than his years, the sea having carved deep lines into his face. His right hand, the one that had struck Vale, still bore the silver ring of crossed anchors. Holmes regarded him quietly. You sent for me. Keir nodded, his voice rough. You're the only one might believe me. I didn't kill the old man. Never even saw him after that night. Someone else, someone higher, paid me to keep quiet. Said I'd hang if I spoke. Then 2 days ago I found this. He drew from his pocket a small scrap of paper, folded and stained. Holmes took it carefully. On it, in neat handwriting, were the words, "The sea keeps its secrets, Jonah. Best you keep yours." Beneath it was drawn a single initial, H. Holmes turned the paper over once, then twice. No signature beyond this. You are certain it arrived after your arrest? Keir nodded. Guard brought it with my breakfast. No one knows how it got there. Holmes's face remained impassive, but his voice dropped a note lower. I believe you, Keir, but tell me, when Alderton hired you, how did he contact you? Through an agent, the sailor said. A man in Plymouth docks called himself Hollis. Holmes looked up sharply. Hollis. The name hung between them like smoke. When we left the cell, Lestrade's face was puzzled. Do you know him? I do, Holmes said grimly. Hollis has appeared before, a broker of secrets, a trafficker in false names, and an occasional informant for the Yard when the wind favors profit. If he played messenger between Alderton and Keir, then he holds the last key to this affair. By evening, a search had traced the man to a tavern near the docks, a rough establishment where sailors gathered to drink away the dangers of the sea. Holmes entered alone, bidding us wait in the carriage. Through the window, I watched the smoky interior swallow his figure. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. At last he emerged, his face pale but composed, a folded letter in his hand. He is dead, he said quietly. Stabbed some hours ago in a brawl, or so they claim, but this was found in his coat. He handed me the letter. It was addressed to Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, though it had never been posted. Sir, if you receive this, I am already beyond your reach. The one who commands us both is nearer to you than you think. The phantom was no myth. It walks still. Seek it in your own reflection. Holmes folded the paper slowly, his face unreadable. Cryptic nonsense, perhaps, but its tone suggests Hollis knew his end was near. Nearer to you than you think. That is not metaphor, Watson. That is warning. We returned to London the next morning. The fog had lifted, replaced by a raw wind that rattled the window panes of Baker Street. Holmes paced the room like a caged thing, his mind clearly struggling with some unseen problem. "Watson," he said abruptly, "there is something profoundly personal in this. I've long suspected that behind certain criminal networks there exists a mind devoted not to gain, but to order. Cold, mathematical order. A man who uses chaos as a means of control. If Hollis spoke truth, then this is no isolated crime, but the echo of a greater design." "You think this Hollis worked under that hand?" I asked. He paused, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I think, Watson, we have brushed against the web of a spider whose threads span more than one case. The phantom of Willow Creek may prove the faintest tremor of something vast." He spoke no more for the rest of the evening. When I retired, I left him still at the window, the lamplight outlining his lean figure against the endless smoke of the city. I did not know then that the cryptic warning from Hollis would one day be echoed in a name whispered throughout London's underworld, a name that Holmes would come to know too well. In the weeks that followed, the Willow Creek affair faded from public attention. The papers turned to new scandals, the magistrate's disgrace buried beneath fresher headlines. Yet I could not forget the faces of those left behind. Miss Alderton vanished from England without a trace. Henry Vale, now living quietly in Cornwall, his name cleared, but his spirit broken. And Holmes himself, who had grown more thoughtful than I ever remembered. He spoke often of the moral fog that clings to justice. And once, when I pressed him, he said, "We chase shadows, Watson, but sometimes they chase back." It was not until months later that I received a small sealed envelope bearing no return address. Inside lay a single photograph, faded, water-stained, of the Willow Creek Inn. Across its bottom, scrolled in a familiar, elegant hand, were the words, "The phantom sleeps, but not forever." I took it at once to Holmes. He examined it under the lamplight, his expression grave. "Miss Alderton," he said softly. "Alive then, and abroad. Somewhere the past has not released her." He turned the photograph over. "But see the watermark here? Italian paper of a kind used in Florence. So she has fled the country. That at least is some comfort. Yet I cannot help but wonder if the spectre she names is not merely memory, but the shadow of something yet to come." He replaced the photograph carefully in its envelope, then placed it within his index of cases marked unpublished. On its spine, he wrote in that fine, precise hand of his, "The phantom at Willow Creek Inn, closed for now." That night, as he took up his violin and began to play, a low, meditative strain that rose and fell like wind across the moor, I felt once again that strange mingling of pride and unease which always accompanied our victories. For though the law had prevailed, there remained somewhere in the vast unseen corridors of crime an intelligence still awake, still watching. And so I write this final note, not as a chronicle of triumph, but as a warning to those who believe reason alone can banish the dark. The truth of Willow Creek was never a ghost, but a mirror, and in it I saw reflected both the brilliance and the solitude of the man I called my friend. He never spoke of it again. Yet on certain mist-laden evenings, when the fire burns low, and the violin lies silent upon its stand, I sometimes see Holmes's eyes grow distant, fixed upon something only he can see. Then I know he has returned in thought to that lonely inn on the moor, to the echo of unseen footsteps fading into the fog. And I too hear them. For the phantom at Willow Creek Inn walks still, not in the world, but in memory, and in the endless pursuit of truth that will forever bind Sherlock Holmes to the shadows he dares to chase. John H. Watson, M.D., Baker Street, 1892.